please help me welcome to the front, Paul Mellor, A Plague on All Your Houses, A Plague on All Your Houses, Paul Mellor. There's one thing I'm going to say to people who are from another club, and just to explain the pattern here. Very often in Toastmasters what we do is we ask somebody else to stand up and tell us what the next speaker is going to do. And what happens is there's usually a bit of a blush and a pause. Oh, what was it? What pathway you're on? What's the name of your title of your talk? And so on. And so we're starting to change that here. And what we're doing is what we call the throat clearing. So that a speaker stands up and is able to talk at the front here and just introduce a little bit of their talk before they actually start the talk. So, Madam Timer, please don't start the talk just yet. That's part of the purpose of this part. This doesn't include the talk. The purpose of my talk today is to deliver on it's my fourth pathway now. This is at the bottom end of the pathway. It's a level 2 speech, and it's going to be on vocal variety and effective body language. And so I'm going to ask Louisa, when she returns, to be my evaluator for that. She may well do a silent evaluation, or she may vocalise Nando, depending on the time requirements. But that's going to be my evaluation. My faults previously have been things like talking too quickly and not enough pauses. So then we'll see whether I can correct some of that today. The purpose of this particular talk, before I get into the talk, I just want to make this a little clearer as well. This is a long form talk, and that's rare in Toastmasters. Most of the time in Toastmasters we do 5 to 7 minute talks. And of course in the real world, you never do 5 to 7 minute talks. It's rare that it's an elevator pitch, right? If I've gone for investment type pitches before, if you're either not welcome or they're asking you to give a solid half an hour. If it's lectures, it's usually up to an hour. So there's realistically longer form talks are required, and we foster that within Pretoria Advanced Club. So downstairs there are small, short, relatively low content talks, and upstairs there are higher content talks. For this talk today, this is a little favourite of mine. I constructed it after COVID with thoughts of pandemics in mind. And really the purpose of this is almost like a gentle public education, if you're not scientifically minded, into medical science, and describing what I see as a beautiful history for a difficult disease. And for people to then reflect on that as you go through this story, and think about its impact on you, and the impact of you with regard to COVID and your future pandemics. All right, thank you. I'm ready for the timer. Madam SAA?
Yes, sorry, before you go into your speech,
yes.
Thank you for your gorgeous introduction. Those that arrived slightly late, this is just a point of order. Those that have not yet paid, can you, 32, have you, 33? Okay, I'm quickly just ordering the meal. I will collect or I'll tell you who is collecting payments in the break. Okay, thank you. Yes, I know that, but I don't know if they know. Yeah. Nando. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, can we do lights please, and first slide. First slide please, Amanda. The title of tonight's talk is A Plague on All Your Houses. Next slide please. Tears, bitter tears, fall in a bitter rain, and my heart trembles with a storm of sighs. When on your beauty bend my burning eyes, for whose soul's sake the world seems flat and vain. Life rushes by on proud, impatient feet, and death pursues her with a massive stride. Ills past and present tear the soul aside. She stepped into my heart so vividly, a thing of light and warmth as well unknown, a princess having wandered from her throne, and now she is dead, and dead my soul in me. This was the lament of a man from the 14th century, an Italian, on the death of his beloved one, Laura. Now, Laura wasn't actually his wife. She was in fact married to someone else altogether, so it was unrequited love. But she died of plague. And I think in that poem taken from the Sonnets of Petrarch in the 14th century, you can sense somewhat the humanity of loss from this devastating disease that traversed the world. Next slide, please. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death in the medieval period, or the Great Pestilence, was a source of utter mystery to the medieval population. It swept across Europe, and there are detailed records of the destruction and death that followed in its wake throughout Europe, indeed in parts of the Middle East, and certainly in China. It started in the 14th century, and in fact, as you will see in this story, it has a very clear start date in Europe, and it continued in patterns and in waves for centuries thereafterwards, coming and going, seemingly in a mystical fashion. On the right, you will see the picture of the Germanic plague doctors who used to wear this leather mask. Bear in mind the masks that you saw in times of COVID, and sometimes the plague constructions, the folk constructions that you could see people doing. And on the left, examples of the plague boils, which we'll come to in a little minute. Next slide, please. Where did this mysterious disease come from? Well, that's part of this wonderful narrative that I'm going to outline for you tonight, this history of science. At a superficial level, we might describe it as an etymological issue in terms of where it came from. The plague in English came from the Old French, plague, and that was to do with destruction, affliction, a blow, evil, slaughter, and the word was in turn taken from the Latin. Now, the etymology of the word, perfect. Can everyone still see the slides? Thank you. Thank you, Nando. The etymology of the word is not really, of course, the origin of the disease. And if we move to the next slide, please. There was a very clearly defined entrance of this disease into Europe. It happened when ships leaving from the modern-day area of the Crimea, that conflict now seen in the current geopolitical climate, which we will touch on again in a few centuries back, as it were, from now, ships departed from the Crimea and drifted down to land at Messina in the port of Sicily in October of 1347. Next slide, please. The sailors that arrived in that port, when they were greeted by the customs officials, they discovered men literally dying and or dead on board those vessels. And they were covered with black lesions and actively discharging boils. The symptoms of the plague are very dramatic. Buboes is one form of the disease, and the buboes refer to these lumps that appear, usually in your sentinel lymph nodes around your body. So they could be at the angle of your jaw, or under your armpits, or at your groin. These were the common locations, and they could appear at other lymph nodes as well. And these swellings would enlarge inexorably and then burst to the outside, and you would be left with this foul-smelling discharge shortly before dying a miserable death. The second clinical form is a pneumonic form. And so this was a devastating respiratory disease. You would start coughing and then coughing up blood, and you would transmit this bacterium, as it will come to in a minute, into the air around you, onto objects, and then of course onto other people. And that was an extremely rapid form of death that resulted from there. And the other form of the plague was the septicemic form. And that is, you're probably familiar with the word septicemia, but essentially a blood-borne infection. The infection is now acutely transiting in your blood, and that also has devastating effects on all of your systems. All of your organ systems start to shut down. And so clinically, that's a particularly nasty presentation and very difficult to recover from. Next slide, please. Once that disease had arrived in Messina, there's documented evidence of it spreading around the rest of Europe. And it happened at an incredible rate of transmission. The effect of this was that in some villages, and we know this from parish records accurately, in some villages across Europe and Britain, there were death rates of 80%. 80% mortality. Overall, the estimates are around 60%. But effectively, you're looking at the majority of people in some locations being wiped out. And so it led to a historical record like nothing else left from the modern times. Here is an image painted by Bruegel the Elder of the triumph of death, painted in homage to this period of the plague. Next slide, please. We were talking about the origin of this disease. And of course, at that time, people had no idea as to where this would have appeared from. They thought that it was the wrath of God. They thought so in the Jewish civilization, across the Islamic Empire, and across the Christian world. They thought that it was due to a lack of piety, or that it might be miasmas, so-called, known from the time of Hippocrates, the bad airs that the ancient Greeks had referred to. They talked about witchcraft. They talked about the Jews poisoning the wells, black cats, you name it. There were all sorts of speculations. Next slide, please. This is an original woodcut taken in Europe. The original woodcut taken in Europe, and showing people who were burnt, Jews that were burnt alive at the time. Next slide. And so you had strange practices arising, including things like the flagellants, made popular in the Da Vinci Code, if you've ever seen that film, and Opus Dei, but the Catholic practice of thrashing themselves, self-flagellation until the blood flowed, hoping that this pious demonstration of their faith to God would stop this devastating disease. Next slide, please. In other words, I want you to reflect on this. There was no method of assessing evidence. There was just belief. There was no idea. There was no framework in which you could undertake a logical understanding as to how this came about. It was Jews, it was witchcraft, it was cats. Next slide, please. As a matter of fact, the Black Death led to the death of feudalism. It was a strong contributory component to that. It certainly altered religiosity throughout Europe, and it paved the way towards the European Renaissance. Next slide, please. And you can go back for a minute. Thank you. This blank slide is because we're now traversing across time and geographies. The Black Death in the medieval period petered out, not completely. It showed the cycles of resurgence over decades and then centuries. But eventually it sort of petered out. And what we were left with Well, think now, COVID seems like a distant memory for most of us, right? The Spanish flu, we've no idea about, 1918. It's a distant memory. And so this faded into almost non-existence until around the 17th century. And in southwest China, next slide please. In Yunnan, we had the appearance of disease problems. Now this is an area in southwest China. China also had very good records of problems and diseases. And there was a poet called Xiu Donan, who recorded the presence of deaths in rats, actually, before the death of people. And the deaths in one day were numberless, according to him. And shortly after he wrote a poem on this subject, he himself died, a young man. So this was known as the Third Great Plague of southwest China. And it, at this time, seemed relatively insignificant until it started to spread around the rest of China and down towards Hong Kong, which was at that time a British colony. Next slide, please. The British were very aware that Hong Kong was their key port in Asia, and it was a key centre of trade. And if the plague escaped through there, that it could damage the trade across the British Empire, which of course, in fact, it subsequently did. As this was going on, there was a great rush to try and deal scientifically, for the first time ever, with the impact of the plague. People were sent from the Pasteur Institute in France, including on the left Dr. Yersin, and scientists from Japan, including on the right Dr. Kitasato. These two men were instrumental in the understanding of disease and the scientific story as to how to work out that this really was a problem. At this time, in 1894, and actually even for the decade, 15, 20 years that followed it, there were still doctors across Western developed societies who argued that the plague was due to miasmas, the ancient Greek, more than 2,500-year-old theory that the disease was due to bad airs, bad gases. Let me just walk you through this from a basic scientific perspective. What these two men both did, Yersin was accredited with this, but what they both did was firstly they documented the clinical signs of the patients that they saw. Secondly, at great risk to themselves, they autopsied these patients and showed the lesions that were present in the dead bodies and documented those clinically and scientifically and pathologically. And then they took samples from there, and in the relatively new field of bacteriology at that time, they were able to demonstrate that bacteria were present there and to show the bacteriological characteristics and grow those bacteria. And then what they did, following Koch's postulates, is taking these bacteria, they injected them into experimental animals. Not a very friendly thing to do, but it was a necessary thing to do. And what they then did at that time was show that these animals succumbed to the same symptoms. And then when they autopsied those animals, they found the same lesions that they had seen in the humans. And when they looked at the bacteriology of those samples, they found the same bacteria in those samples that they did in the humans. And then they were able to show that there was a causation, if you will. That's basic causation in human medicine. It's known as Koch's postulates. Beyond that, they also showed that these bacteria were present in rats that had also died and were affected by the disease. And they even speculated that the cause was probably maybe in fleas. These men transformed the scientific understanding of the disease. This was the first time in a major pandemic that there had been a successful demonstration scientifically of the cause of the problem. Next slide, please. So this sounds like a great accomplishment, and it sounds relatively unequivocal. And people said, throughout the coming course of that century, throughout the 20th century, that, well, it sounds as though that disease is very similar to the thing that happened back in the medieval period. Probably the same problem. Must be the same bacteria. Should be. Okay, we can't go back and test it, but it should be the same thing. Now, the interesting thing about medicine is that many things look the same, but they're not. Life is just complex in biology. And so people started to question, much later, around the 1970s, that maybe this didn't really add up. And this chap, Prof. Shrewsbury, who was based at the University of Birmingham in England, turned around and said, hang on a minute, we've looked at parish records of deaths in Britain, and there were overwhelming numbers of deaths, devastating numbers, the sort of numbers that you don't normally get with a bacteria, which is what the plague is. There have been in history many plagues described. Cholera plagues now we know of, and smallpox plagues. There have been many other plagues described. Maybe they got it wrong. Even though it looks like it could have been the buboes and the lumps and, it could be the same disease, it doesn't make sense. And if you go to the historical record, there are detailed records of the disease arriving in a town and people falling dead 24 hours later, an impossibly short time for most normal bacterial diseases. It's much more typical of acute viral diseases, examples of which include things like the filoviruses. Next slide, please. And these are, you'll have heard of these in terms of things like Ebola. Okay? The pattern of the disease, the devastating numbers that were involved, it's maybe more typical of certain viral diseases. And this gained credibility. There were a number of people that researched this topic and look at the dates all the way through to 2008, not that long ago. Next slide, please. So then, this has now happened centuries ago, right? Centuries ago. But it's important, and long before COVID, that we understand the nature of these disease emergencies. How could you go back and look? My oldest child, sitting in the back there, has actually been to a plague pit before in England. It happened to be in a friend's house, and they were digging to extend the house, and they happened to find a common plague pit that became of archaeological interest and consequence. And so in Britain it's quite problematic. You're digging in some areas, you unexpectedly come across this. Your housing project is going to be on hold for good reason. So a number of European teams went back and they had a look at various sites and they dug down to where these plague bodies were buried. And then they took soil samples on the way down, and they took soil samples underneath, and they took samples at the level of. And then they took teeth out of some of these skulls, and they drilled into the teeth because they know that from a genetic perspective you can harvest material thousands and tens of thousands of years later, particularly well preserved within the pulp cavity of your tooth. And they were able to test this using forms of DNA analysis like PCR and show unequivocally, scientifically prove that the DNA extracted from this was consistent with the bacterial disease Yersinia, and that it was nothing to do with Prof. Shrewsbury's speculation of a viral cause. If that wasn't enough, you can do something called F1 antigen testing. The details don't matter, but it's a totally different way of looking at the samples, non-genetic manner, and demonstrate that also that this was down to the plague. So we now have independent proof that that plague was present within the teeth of those dead bodies. It was not present in the soil above, it was not present in the soil below, and it wasn't present in the teeth of other dead bodies from other time periods. And that's a solid scientific demonstration of probable cause. This was the first proof that the medieval Black Death was indeed down to that same bacteria that the Japanese doctor and the French doctor had elucidated some time before. Next slide, please. Now, the story gets even more satisfying from here. There was a chap called Philip Slava who works at the University of Stirling. He's a historian, he's not a doctor, he's not a scientist. And he was going through records of deaths in cemeteries in a strange area of Kyrgyzstan. And he saw that there was a spike in the record of these deaths. He was kind of looking at it, actually. He knew what he was looking for. And he saw this spike of deaths in the mid-part of the 1300s. And he went over, organised a little tour, and looked at the gravestones, an image of which is on the right, that are very characteristic of the stones in this part of the world, Central Asia. And what he saw was that there were inscriptions on there that reference the presence of the plague, which they call, I'm not sure about my pronunciation here, forgive me, but Mortana, the pestilence. Next slide, please. He then teamed up with a bunch of German scientists who decided to investigate this area again. And in a good, solid demonstration of scientific controlled, a sensible, rational approach to testing, they looked at the graves that were clearly outlined by dates. They also looked at water flow through these grave sites to see whether there might be cross-contamination from one grave to another. And then they tested the individual grave sites, both those that were before this spike in deaths and after, and of course during. And what they showed was that you could find the DNA of the bacteria, of the plague bacteria, in the teeth of the dead bodies that were recorded as Mortana, recorded as plague deaths. But you couldn't find that in people who had died before, nor after. Nor could you find it in the soil, nor was there cross-contamination across grave sites. I hope it's a beautiful demonstration of scientific thinking and evidence-based thinking. Next slide, please. And to tie this all neatly together as we come to the end of this, I want to try and to give you one other piece of information. And this is delivered by a historian from an American university. Again, not a scientist, but working with scientists and actually published a lot in the history of science. And what she showed was that the pattern of the plague that had appeared from Kyrgyzstan disseminated further away from there in parallel with the Mongol hordes. So the attacks of Genghis Khan's descendants, in fact. Now, one thing that I should have said in the previous slide was the beauty of that work done by Philip Slavin and the German scientists was that they showed that the actual originator of the bacteria. So they were able to look, you can do this almost like a genetic tree, just like you can have done for yourself. They look at the genetic tree, it's called phylogenetic analysis, they look at the branches of the tree, and they're able to pin down the original organism, how it's related to the ones that disseminated in other countries, in China, in Europe, in the Middle East, etc. from there. So you get this beautiful little genetic tree that helps you trace the original organism. And so the original organism was found in Kyrgyzstan. And this is where Genghis Khan's descendants were riding their horses out and attacking people across the rest of the Central Asia, the Middle East, and into Europe. And where did they go? Into the aforementioned Crimea. And they wouldn't surrender. And so what did they do? They took infected plague corpses and trebucheted them, catapulted them into the city, infecting the city and infecting themselves. And if you remember back to the start of the story, and this happened, by the way, in the year 1347, because there are good records of that occurring. And if you remember at the start of the story, that, next slide please, is where the boats came in and landed at Messina in Sicily and brought the disease to Europe. Next slide, please. We tend to think of diseases in terms of ourselves. How do they affect humans? Now, I'm actually a vet by training, And my interest in this subject is in a parallel disease to this that affects some other animals. But I became interested in this particular condition because there's a lot of commonality. There's a major overlap between one disease and another. It's not just humans. We are just another animal. And one of the key animals that hosts this disease is the grey marmot that's found all over Russia and Central Asia. Next slide, please. It's very similar to the marmot that you see here. This is a modern-day Mongolian actually wearing the skins of his marmots, and they still hunt them. Apparently a very nice thing to do is you cook everything inside them on an open fire, throw in a few potatoes, a bit of rice, that sort of thing. But I've never had the fortune or misfortune to try this, but this is apparently a delicacy and very commonly, well, it's standard food, right? It's standard food over there, so they still eat it to this day. Next slide, please. The problem is that the plague isn't just something of the past. Most of us are around here now. If you sit here horrified at this, the only reason you can be sitting here horrified at this is because your ancestors survived the plague. This plague almost certainly came through Africa. There aren't records of it here, but it will have affected here as well. So your ancestors survived the plague, as they did in the Middle East, as happened in Europe, as happened in the Far East, etc. But this still goes on to this day. Next slide, please. And in fact, this is an old graph now, but this is a graph of modern-day foci for the geographical location for the plague around the world. There have been outbreaks in Madagascar, so not so far away, in recent years. Next slide, please. Okay, we're coming to the end of this talk, and I want to make you think a little bit. We won't have time to address everything. This is a short lecture. But on the right-hand side is a graph, and it's showing crude mortality rates by country for COVID. And I want you to reflect on the fact that the COVID crude mortality rate was under 0.3% in all probability, numbers still being adjusted. And the Black Death crude mortality rate was around 60%. 60%. Next slide, please. This slide is taken from a fresco in a small church very close to where we used to live, spend time, in Croatia, in Istria. It's about 30 minutes drive away. It's known as the Dancer of Death, and it was painted in the 15th century. And also a tribute, an extraordinary church with extraordinary frescoes, painted as a tribute, as it were, to the horrors of the Black Death. We've come all the way round, and in this talk, I've described one disease to you that started as a mystery, and the human mind looks for patterns, and when it has no way to rationalize evidence, then it becomes the stuff of superstition, belief, religion, persecution. And what we've done is I've shown you a route to how this disease was understood over time, and how it was unequivocally demonstrated all the way through to the past few years, and the layers of evidence, and the numbers of international teams, and the different types of experts that contributed to an understanding of this disease. I want to take you back. Can we have the lights off again, please? To this medieval period to finish this talk. And I'd like you to read to you the notes that were made at the time in the 14th century by Agnolo de Tura. He was a shoemaker in Siena in Italy. The plague was a cruel and horrible thing. Father abandoned child. Wife abandoned husband. And they died by the hundreds. in the tomb, buried my 5 children with my own hands. So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. Another hand for Paul, then one for Steve. Sitting at the time.
How did I do time-wise?
Yeah, you didn't make half an hour, sorry. No, you're under.
Oh, okay, good.
You were 30 minutes, 48 seconds.
Then I started time right. I got 28. Okay. Then, in that case, when are we starting? When will the juniors?
It's time. It's meant to be for 7:30, so it's time for Q&A. If you want. As the evaluation, if you want.
I think I would like a Q&A because we've got 5 minutes until the dinner break, right? I think I would like a Q&A if you wouldn't mind. If you wouldn't mind, Sam. So I have I've actually read accounts. Being formally, just want to clarify one thing. Being formally Catholic, while I'm not fond of them, it's not a Catholic thing to do the flag thing. It is literally just the crazies that do that group of Opus Dei. Anyway, so there was a stage where they attributed the spread of the plague to a particular Pope Clement, I think the third or the second, who was a general in the French army during the Fourth Crusade, in roughly towards the end of the 13th century, came back and just had a almost crazed, fanatical hatred of cats, and ordered all cats in the Vatican and then throughout Rome and throughout, at that time, the Holy Roman Empire, to be killed. And there were many people who, because of the papal edict that the Pope is infallible, you know about that one. All right. They had to obey. And many people attribute the spread, because at that time they believed that it was because of the rats, to this crazy Pope.
Yeah.
Total rubbish or something?
No, probably likely. 2 things. Firstly, just from a matter of history, if anyone wants to fact check this, Google us. Was the papacy not in Avignon, in France at that time?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. And I only went to Avignon in the 14th century.
Was it? Okay, thank you. And then secondly, the association with rats surprisingly wasn't made until relatively modern times. It wasn't until that Third Great Plague.
No, they only started blaming him in like the 1940s.
Oh yes, yeah. So almost certainly that contributed to it. Now it wouldn't have stopped the plague, because the point that Nando is making is that the cats would have contributed to rat catching and thereby reduced the rodent population present in houses and thereby potentially reduced transmissibility from rat fleas to humans of the plague bacteria. And that could have led to a lower death rate. But in reality, I think at that time that ecosystem would have been one part of it, but it wouldn't have stopped the overwhelming wave, if you will, of death.
Okay. There was another little thing. Apparently, the Great Fire of London. 1666. A lot of people attribute the proper halt of the plague, because there were still remnants of plague all the way until the 1700s and 1800s. Actually attribute the halt of the plague to that fire, less than 9 people died.
Okay.
In the Great Fire, sorry, less than 60 people died in the Great Fire. How bad was the transmission because of dead bodies? Because remember, during that time, Christianity, you weren't allowed to burn, you weren't allowed to cremate bodies. So is there evidence that the bacteria would still be able to be cultured even in the dead body?
Yeah, almost certainly. And for long periods afterwards. So it would remain relatively stable in dead bodies, decomposing bodies for quite a long time. Now, I don't have off the top of my head the length of time. This sort of stuff is actually studied. So another example of a bacteria that does that for potentially even hundreds of years is Bacillus anthracis, which is the cause of anthrax. And so bacteria are capable of going into dormant states for astonishingly long times. And whilst the body's decomposing, it would almost certainly pose a risk.
And viruses, they die.
Viruses die more quickly.
Because it's spread.
They usually spread quickly. An unusual feature of this particular bacteria at this particular time was its transmissibility.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What was the main form of transmission between humans? Was it airborne?
Bearing in mind that there's no way of studying that now.
No, sure.
Right. But so that it's tricky because you're relying on a combination of modern understanding of pathogenesis. So how is it transmitted in the current state? If you go to Madagascar and you get plague now, how does it transmit? And so there's a fairly good understanding of the mechanisms, bubonic versus septicemic versus pneumonic now. When you try and trace that back to the historical record, that's going to be very difficult because you're really speculating. But if you're looking at someone arriving, there's some documented examples in Europe, people shut themselves off, they would kill people rather than allow them into their village or town. The news of the plague had spread. There was kind of a massive quarantine, a massive attempt to stop mobility. Of course, people were trying to escape from different areas as the plague was advancing. And so there are quite good records of examples where the plague arrived somewhere. Someone had snuck in, someone had been let in, someone had gone out and got it, and they came back. And then people dying 24 hours later. Astonishingly fast for a bacterial disease. And that's almost certainly the pneumonic form, and all the septicemia.
So airborne.
So airborne. In some cases.
Okay, and then what role did the rats and their fleas play?
Well, that's thought to be incredibly strong because it became known as the bubonic disease because that was a common presentation. So the presence of buboes and the slow development of the disease is more likely to have taken place because of not aerosol contamination, but flea bites and fleas then transmitting the bacteria to you. We have another question, young Rafe.
Is it true that in England they would keep flowers in their pockets because they believed that it would save them from plague?
I think so. Hence the sort of ring a roses.
Yes.
So it was because of the smell.
The smell, so that they used to put herbs in those
I do know
beaks.
that.
Yes, and the masks.
Another
The
question. Was it believed that the plague was people who had died of the plague that had come back for revenge?
I'm sure about
That
that.
was a Polish urban legend, yes. In Eastern Europe, yes. They believed that.
You might be one too many zombie stories. I don't know. Oh yeah, sorry.
So, just a comment and a question.
Yes.
Something I found out, I'm not sure it is a few years ago, was that when someone sneezes and you say bless you, it was from that time because chances are if they're sneezing, they're about to die. So God bless you because that's true. It's not true. But do you know if they ever studied long-term mental effects of the people from that time?
The long-term mental effects.
Because I mean, 80% of your village died.
You just had to get on with it.
I don't know. I mean, other than I think, you know, the echoes from history of things like that lament by Petrarch, or the moving accounts by that shoemaker from Siena, I think you find these examples that people wrote down contemporaneously. But I don't think there will be any studies of the from a psychological perspective from that period. Right at the back, Louisa.
You mentioned that bacteria can remain stable in dormant states for much longer, up to 100 years for the anthrax causing virus, or bacteria, and that viruses die off much more quickly. So they did the extraction of the teeth to get the pulp to verify that this was the bacteria that was present. Did they just take it as, okay, the bacteria was present, that's enough causation? Or, because you said it's astonishingly fast for a bacteria, and if the viruses weren't able to survive, were they just taking it that, oh, there's presence of bacteria DNA, so it had to have been the bacteria? Would viral DNA even have shown up? Could there have been a piggybacking kind of the virus was what made it accelerate so fast? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
It's a very, very reasonable question, and one that, if you'll excuse my turn of English, plagues medicine and veterinary medicine to this day. The difficulty that you have is that very often you do have diseases that lead essentially to comorbidities. So a modern day example in this country in particular would be something like HIV. And so if you look at people who are affected by HIV and then develop AIDS, what do they die of?
Tuberculosis.
Very often it's not HIV/AIDS, it's the secondary bacteria that they develop, like tuberculosis, or elsewhere Cryptococcus, which is a protozoal organism. So yes, it's much more complicated. I think the demonstration was useful from a twofold perspective. Firstly, it showed in a paleogenetic manner, really, right? I mean, you've always got the problem of when you go back in time, you know, you try and harvest dinosaur DNA, like they've managed, etc. The further you go back, the more difficult it is to extract that information. And it's not linearly difficult for different organisms. Okay, you've got problems when you're trying to identify more than, you can identify more than one problem, that's easy. Okay, but what you don't know is the what's the word I'm looking for? The validity and the stringency of that problem, of that organism being present or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, on appearance, the plant looked more like the typical leprosy that was reported during the Bible times. Was there any relationship to that? By the way they were trying to diagnose it, like the doctors that you mentioned were trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Because I've read somewhere that at some point in Europe, they made doctors who were trying to use mental healing, putting their patients mental healing. Yeah, like putting their patients to, is it called hypnosis, and try to heal them of leprosy and other things. Although they were being further accused of witchcraft and things like that. But was there a relationship between those plaques of Bible times and things like that?
Yeah, so that's one of the problems. Is I mean, there's different parts to your question. Okay, so let me deal with the first part of your question is the complexity of disease, and particularly from a historical perspective. If you're looking globally now, there's more than 300,000 bacteria known. And there are something like 6 million viruses plus. And so the problem is that we have large numbers of different diseases causing different problems. We're trying to work out in the past whether that was a disease that caused this particular problem is very tricky. And so one way to do it is initially on symptoms. You can reasonably group some diseases, a cancer problem, let's say on average, doesn't look like this leprosy type problem. And so if we've got some level of accuracy in those records, then we can reasonably speculate that they were two different diseases. Leprosy and this disease, the plague, they're not the same, and nor smallpox. So I hope that answers your question to some degree.
Can carry on during dinner. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.